Nick, are you going to edit this before you post it?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And I think we're
Just
live now.
wanted, you're going to tell people where they can get it. Okay,
Yeah.
good. But you'll tell people where they can get this. I had some people call me and say they couldn't be in on it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Megan will make sure that we get it out.
Okay.
Yeah. Looks like people are coming in. Good to see the number of participants here.
I don't see that. So that's just as good for me. It's just you and me.
Great. Let's wait another 30 seconds or so.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, let's get going, and I'm sure more people will come in as we go here. But I am so honored today to be having this book talk with Tim Love. I've known Tim for, I don't know, almost more than a year now, Tim, and you've been such a boost to our work and such a just a creative soul to kind of be in this fight with. Um, Before I introduce Tim, though, let me just say that this is part of our the work that our Council for Responsible Social Media has been doing. And when we talk about the Council for Responsible Social Media, what we talk often about is our deranged information environment. And we use that word intentionally. In fact, I looked up the term many months ago of where deranged comes from. And I just want to remind everyone it comes from the French term déranger, which means to disturb or disorganize or throw into disorder. I thought the last one of those, throw into disorder, is the most interesting. But the reason why we do this work at Issue One is because we feel as if the fundamentals of democracy are that you have to have common facts, common narratives, and you have to be able to talk to each other and to work through disagreements. And that's at the most basic level. Before you get to our campaign finance system or how we draw congressional lines or the independence of the judiciary or the power of the executive branch, at the most fundamental level, we have to be able to have the same conversation in this country about how we see the world and about our future. And that has to be based on facts. But when you have an information environment like ours, a deranged one, you have a situation in which all of society has been thrown into disorder, and that's what Tim is writing about. So let me tell you more about him, and then I'm going to ask you, Tim, a couple questions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, which I believe you can write into the Q&A section on the Zoom here. And we'll go for about 40 minutes or so. So, Tim, welcome. Tim is the former vice chairman of the Omnicom Group, which is a global ad agency. During his 42 years in advertising, he built brands for global clients like P&G, Nissan, and Pepsi, and worked in more than 138 countries. He has served on various boards, including the Advertising Council and the Institute for Advertising Ethics. Post-retirement, he taught at Oxford's School of Business and at the U.S. State Department's Foreign Service Institute. He has also lectured at institutions like Harvard, Yale, and Columbia, and he serves on our Council for Responsible Social Media. So you can see his book behind him. The title is striking, and I'm sure many of you are aware of the Marshall McLuhan quote that the medium is the message, but he's got a different spin on it, which is the medium is the mirror. And in the book, he writes, quote, the medium is no longer just the message. The medium is the mirror. The medium, social media, impacts in new ways, reforming and reshaping our politics, our relationships, and our sacred beliefs. So, Tim, tell us more about this kind of migration or evolution from the critique that the medium is the message to the medium being the mirror.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk. And this book has been in the works for my entire career in advertising, which is really about the art and science of persuasion. And and I loved my career, and I worked with, as you said, some of the best clients in the world, and got to learn my craft in a variety of cultures all over the world. I lived in Belgium for 6 years, Tokyo for 2 years, Singapore for 4 years, and New York in between the rest of the time. So I'm originally from Ohio. And I want to say up front that I was born into a Republican family, and I feel that I'm a moderate Republican. My imprint for president was Eisenhower. Uh, but honestly, I have not voted Republican since H.W. Bush. So I tell you that because I find that a lot of people in this deranged environment of information want to immediately put people on one side or the other. And that's because we are extremely polarized. People know this, and there's no better evidence of our polarization than our Congress. When societies are polarized, they are paralyzed. And George Orwell in 1984 wrote about this, having seen the Civil War in Spain and then the rise of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And basically, what his message was that when a society or a community has difficulty assessing what popular opinion is, if they're not sure what the popular opinion is, it allows radical ideas to more easily propagate because they stick out more. And when people are confused, I know I'm this way too. When I feel confused, it's very uncomfortable. And Maslow has talked about this a lot in his psychology studies. But when we're confused, sometimes some people react differently to confusion. Some try to solve the confusion. Some try to lead their way out of it and lead others. And others give up and follow because it's easier to follow. And when there's a bright, shiny point of view that's more easily perceivable, sometimes that draws the attention of the people who are frustrated and following. The book started with an analysis of what is truth. And my perception when I returned from working overseas for so many years, my perception was that we were having another Reformation, not unlike the Reformation that happened in the 16th century when the printing press upset the perception of who had authority for truth. And during that time, the authority for truth in the world was the Catholic Church. They were the authority for describing what happens in the Bible and what the meaning of the Bible was. And they carefully protected that by using Latin and calligraphy. And they were the only ones authorized to do that interpretation until the printing press enabled another Catholic priest, Martin Luther, to come up with different ideas that were not the same as the popes. And it was called the Reformation because all hell broke loose in the world. And it wasn't just the printing press. There were major technology improvements in terms of sailing capability, like the rear rudder, which made boats more navigable, the ability to go from one mast to multiple masts and multiple sails so information and goods could travel faster, and the development of the canal system, particularly in Europe, where goods and services and different cultures could be exposed to different communities that otherwise were isolated. And in that way, it was sort of like what we've experienced with the internet. It's very wrenching for people who are not used to different foods, languages, and different people. with different beliefs. And many know that the Reformation was a very violent time. There were people that were burned at the stake, and my book goes into this, so I won't go into it a lot now. But it's not unlike the feeling that exists right now in America, because we're having a Reformation, and that Reformation is breeds doubt and and fear of new ideas. And my assessment when I started this assignment or this initiative was that we were being brainwashed. And I was afraid to use that term because it's such a powerful and uh, connotative term. And so I've been studying it, and I've, studied the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the Mental Disorders that the American Psychiatric Association has published. And brainwashing is something that definitely most Americans believe does exist. Unfortunately, I have to admit they thought that it was something done by advertising people. And so for many years, I would say, no, I'm not brainwashing people. I'm telling the truth, because the truth is what builds brands. And if you coerce somebody to do something that's not beneficial to them, they'll penalize you by not buying your brand, or worse yet, they'll tell their friends and families not to. But I admit, full disclosure, that the art and science of persuasion is a very careful and potentially dangerous stick. And I've studied it and practiced it my whole life. And what I can tell you is that there's some characteristics of brainwashing from history that we know. One is the technique that was used on American uh, prisoners of war during the Korean War by the Chinese. And our US military was so concerned about this that they assigned people to study what was going on. And my book explains the process. I checked last night because one of my podcast participants had been a U.S. Army intelligence agent during the Korean War, and he was one of my first podcasts on discovering truth, and he's the first chapter of my previous book. And he was remarkable because he's since passed away. He was remarkable because he asked me to read a bunch of things, and he didn't want to talk about brainwashing. It was sort of like a military guy not wanting to talk about his battles. But he told me that there were probably over 1,000 case studies of prisoners in the National Archives in Washington. And I never did anything with it until last night. And there are, and they're there to be studied. But what the psychologists will tell you about brainwashing is most people's perception is that it's associated with duress and torture and physical harm. And that's because we were imprinted on the Manchurian Candidate and other experiences that you can't be brainwashed unless there's force. I can tell you from an advertising standpoint that you can be brainwashed without force. And the characteristics that the American Psychiatric Association says, they don't honor this as a mental disorder, but they say that it's associated with PTSD. And I believe that America has had PTSD ever since 9/11. I saw it happen 1 mile out of my window in New York, and I saw what happened to the people that saw it. I saw people quietly never come back to New York, and there's still people that are suffering from the PTSD of that. There's also some characteristics of brainwashing that have to do with addiction psychology, with cults, with hostage society. You may have heard about Stockholm syndrome, and also religion and politics, because these are very judgmental and subjective opinions that people have. So there's a lot of work that needs to be happening on this. And what I hope my book is an intervention. I want my book to be an intervention because we are so polarized in this country right now. And my my message is that we need to forgive each other because we've been polarized by intent and by the way a new medium works on our ability to think and draw conclusions about truth. And that is primarily that this new medium, the internet, has caused us to shift how we communicate and how we discuss ideas. What we're having right now, Nick, is called synchronous communication.
Well, I want to get to that. I want to get to synchronous and
Okay,
asynchronous, Tim.
sorry.
But let me stay on the Reformation for a second. So the Reformation had um, many people think it had a positive, mostly a positive effect. The
Yes,
freeing of
yes.
information created a greater heterogeneity of opinions. It was able to shake up the status quo in a way that loosened the grip that a few people had on power.
And people were able to get educated that prior to that were not able to get educated.
Right. So this,
Huge
I wonder,
improvement.
the downside, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about it, is that there were witch hunts, that there were propagandists who were able to seed the public with tremendous fear and fables, disinformation narratives that created, as you said, a lot of destruction and violence. I mean, I would love for you to project us forward 15 or 20 years. Do you think this Reformation, driven by this technology, could end up having a net positive effect? Or do you think that
Yes.
will have a net negative? Because right now we're definitely in the net negative territory, which is why you
Well,
why you wrote
it
the
uh,
book.
it depends on if who you're talking to. Of course, if you
Yeah.
talk to one of the oligarchs that runs our in this country, they will say it's very positive because it's very positive on the stock market.
Right.
Um, I definitely think it's leading us to some breakthrough ideas and breakthrough things. The original Reformation, or the one that happened with the printing press and the sailing technology and the discovery of the chronometer and maps and so forth, that led to the age of discovery, and it led to the age of enlightenment in the
Hmm.
world. It affected politics, it affected religions, it affected people's the way of life. And I believe that we're having that transition, and it's not something that just happens and stops. We've set off on a new voyage
Yeah.
with this information, and it can lead to wonderful benefits for human beings and the human existence and our planet. It can also lead to the kinds of acrimony that happened with the original Reformation. And so, what I'm trying to say is, I want to have an intervention
Yeah.
to at least maybe I can have people put their guns down on either side and say, wait a minute, we've all been affected by this. I'm not saying it's one side or the other. When I give these lectures and I meet with people in the communities, they want to think I'm on one side or the other. And I'm saying, no, I'm only able to talk about this not from a political standpoint, but from a communication arts standpoint, which is what
Yeah.
my profession was.
Yeah, and I think that as you mentioned in the book, the thing that kind of the evolution that occurred in the information environment in the mid 19th century with the advent of journalism, it started channeling information into a better realm. All the penny press and yellow journalism and the kind of culture of disinformation started getting siphoned into more productive means. And then, as you well know, 1920s journalistic standards basically took over the media environment and
Yes.
became the norm for anyone who wanted to make money by producing information, they had to adhere to certain standards. Now, those standards they still exist, of course, in the legacy media, but they don't exist at all in social media. Um, and part of what I want you to talk a little bit more about is like, what are there are actual legal fixes that we'll get to later in the conversation, but what are some of the cultural changes that we need to go through so that this new media, social media, heavily distributed media, is capable of being more of a positive force?
I think the first thing is to come to some kind of uh, agreement or permission to think that maybe there's some conditions that we have unwittingly been uh, affected by. And that's because every time there's been a new communication technology throughout history, and before the printing press, but the beginning of the magazine era in America, when it was distributed on railroad systems across this country more instantaneously, the power of magazines became enormous. History, if as you've probably heard, many people have said, what we learn from history is we don't learn from history, and we don't teach communication history very well. But the magazine era had some abuses. Some people had fake advertising. They had, you've heard of snake oil salesmen, and you've heard of fake real estate deals, and articles written about places and events that didn't happen. So there was a blowback from people who had been harmed by these
Mm-hmm.
in the magazine era. And they went to Washington and or went to their local mayor, and the mayor went to the governor, and the governor went to Washington, and they said, we got to do something about this because these people are being harmed and they have had losses. So they went to the media, to the magazines, and a really neat thing happened, and a very American thing. I want to emphasize this. I had a meeting when I was in Singapore with the Secretary of Treasury, Tim Geithner. I had 2 minutes to tell him what was my perception of what was going on in Asia, along with some other businessmen. And I said that one of America's most powerful advantages and tools is advertising. And the reason is that advertising supported the media and made that media proliferate more quickly into the culture because it could be obtained free. And what happened was there was a threat to whether the magazines would be able to continue or not. And they got together with the advertisers and they developed standards. They also got together with the journalists, and there was a journalist named Williams from Missouri, and he wrote the Williams Creed, which was a set of principles that journalists were to follow. And I think those principles need to be reviewed.
Mm-hmm.
I've looked at them, Nick. They're a little masculine and
Mm-hmm.
a little too religious for my taste, but the principles served the journalist industry very well. Then we had the radio industry, and that started with ham radio operators. A lot of the kids in today's world don't realize that. Well, a ham radio operator could get on the frequency and talk to another ham radio operator in the neighboring county. And it was primarily used for weather reports at the beginning. But as it became more prevalent, some of those radio operators got a little frisky and a little weird and started proselytizing some things in events that didn't happen. Many older Americans have heard the story of Orson Welles in the famous radio show in 1938 when he announced that Martians were landing in America, and people went to a town in New Jersey where they thought that was happening, and they went there with their guns. So he was able to do that with just an announcement and some sound effects. But what happened was the radio industry also coincided with the time when we observed Italy buying all the newspapers and radios under the Mussolini fascist government. And we were concerned that that could happen here. And there were attempts by Germany and Italy to penetrate our radio business and ham radio operators. So we set up the FCC. It's a little more complicated, but it's in my book. The FCC was set up so that the radio operators would be licensed, and to get a license, they had to follow certain standards. They also had to promise to put a percentage of their time, their logs, made available for public service advertising for the good of America. And that coincided with World War II and the development of the War Advertising Council, which was set up to offset the propaganda that we were being inundated with in this country from Italy and Germany. And of course, people need to be reminded, I guess, that there's quite a large Italian and German population in America. So it was there was a lot of confusion and a lot of polarization that happened then. Then television started, and oh my gosh, all of a sudden it's sight, sound, and motion, and it's sort of like when people talk today about AI and the fears and what's going to happen and what it could do. Well, television had the same thing, and it was coincided with the beginning of the Cold War, a lot of fear. It coincided with Orwell's book, 1984, which was written in 1945. And it also coincided with some polarization called McCarthyism.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was an awful lot of polarization in this country. And it was decided that we needed to revise our communications policy, and largely for defensive reasons, but also to make sure that our information systems weren't corrupted and that there were standards being followed. So all of that said, I want you to know that when the internet first came into my life, I was living in Belgium. I was operating on a global basis with people all over the world, and I was using voice messages, telephone, and faxes, and postal services. That's when FedEx and DHL started, so we could send recommendations to other places. And somebody came to and I had a word processor, and the word processor was attached to a printer. And I called that word processor a computer because that's what everybody called it, but it was a word processor. It replaced my typewriter. And it replaced a lot of work that administrative assistants had been doing in terms of typing. But somebody came in one day and said, Tim, you're going to be able to use your word processor, your computer, and you're going to be able to communicate with people all over the world using something called email. And I went, wow, you mean I can deal with Asia in the morning from Brussels, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and Eastern Europe during the day, North America and South America in the evening, and I can do it all with email, because the guy who had the job before me put a fax in his bedroom. I wasn't going to do that. So I wanted to know, how do I get on this thing called email? And they said, you get a modem and you plug it into a telephone line. So my initial impression was that it was telephone related, of course. And there was a lot of fear in America when the internet started around in the early 1990s, that we could get outflanked like we did in the space race by Russia. Now, many people of your listeners and young people know about the atom bomb race because of Oppenheimer, and know what the fear was with that. And I guess Americans can say fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, that we were able to get that instead of Nazi Germany. But the space race started next, and we were wanting to lead that too. And then in 1956, Russia sent up the Sputnik and beat us. And America said, holy cow, they have a hydrogen bomb and they can go to space and they've beaten us. How did they do that? Well, we're not going to let them do that ever again. We're not going to let anybody get ahead of us in technology. So by 1994, with the emerging internet, it was penetration of the internet in the United States was 15% of adults, not households, adults. So think about who was using it in the early days. And the government said, we better find out where this is going, a lot like AI, so we don't get behind and we don't get blindsided like we did with Sputnik. So they met with the platforms at the time, the internet providers, and that was AOL and CompuServe and Prodigy and others that younger users may not be familiar with. But they said, what can we do to help you continue to lead the world? By the way, we had about 15% penetration. The rest of the world had less than 1%. Russia didn't have it. China didn't have it. India didn't have it. North Korea didn't have it. And Iran didn't have it. So we wanted to be sure that we could maintain leadership. And we knew that each military of every country in the world was experimenting with it, like we had. But we were the first to make it practical. And so the internet providers at the time said, well, don't put any restrictions on us. The same thing they're saying with AI. And it's understandable. They said, we don't know where this is going to go. And if you put too many restrictions on us, it'll prevent us from, we could get blindsided by another country that doesn't have restrictions. So they said, okay. And they said, well, in other media in America, a strong suit of American media been that it's been advertising supported, and that's enabled people to access it more readily and more efficiently. Do you think this is going to be an advertising medium? And they said no.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be subscriptions, which means, for people that don't know what that means, it means like telephone service, a monthly bill. Okay. And the government said, well, we better go ask the advertisers. And the advertisers, might have a different point of view. I was working with the world's largest advertiser. I saw what was happening with my kids and with my emails. And so I went to that world's largest advertiser and I said, shouldn't we be looking at this? And a very bright guy who I got very close to over the years and have tremendous respect for, said in 1994, he said no. And I said, why? And he said, because the screen's too small.
Mm-hmm.
That was long before the BlackBerry and long before the iPhone came out in 2007. But I can see why he said that now. He said that because the screen was about as big as what you're looking at now and what those that are listening in are looking at. And we forget that the internet in those days was all type. There was no video. There was no sound. There was very little color, no pictures. And he didn't want me taking my eye off of the marker of where their advertising was going on a global basis. And this large advertisers are always working closely with the media because they want to know what new technology is coming. And they knew that the television medium was going to be going to high definition television screens and much bigger formats. So they wanted their agency guy focused on video and commercials and to move our expertise away from print and radio to television. He didn't want me trying to figure out the internet until it became something that they could access. So
I want yeah.
I just want to finish the story. So the government decided, and the reason I'm telling this story is one of the founders of the Council for Responsible Social Media, a colleague of yours, is the former Speaker of the House, Dick Gephardt. He was the Speaker of the House when this decision was made. And the decision was made that they would not have any responsibility for user content. And some people said, well, with other media like magazines, radio, in the early days of television, there were some abuses made by people who were nefarious and took advantage of the medium. What will you do if there's child pornography or human trafficking? And the platforms basically said, we'll operate on a good faith basis. That's why Section 230 is called the Good Samaritan Clause. They said they'd operate on a good faith basis and take it down, but they asked the government to protect them if they took it down from being sued by the people they took it down. And that protection was provided. So what happened? It didn't turn out to be subscriptions.
Right.
It's turned out to be an advertising medium like we've never seen before because we can communicate to individuals. We don't waste messages on audiences and peripheral audiences. And
And you know more about that individual than you ever did before. You know
right,
everything about
right.
that.
And there's a really good book called The Anxious Generation by
Yeah.
one of our members of the council, Jonathan Haidt, professor at NYU. And he says that this started when the like, share, and retweet buttons started. And I can tell you from an advertising standpoint, that's exactly when it happened because all of a sudden we weren't doing research to find out what somebody's intention was. We had proof of what their behavior was. They'd put send, click, like, share, and we just whew, said, we're going to talk to that individual. And that's what's been happening. And unfortunately, like other media, there are abuses, and those abuses are pretty significant. There are things like kids, the kids are the most vulnerable. The suicide rate has gone up in this country at an alarming rate. It's now the second leading cause of death among adolescents. There's the platforms will tell, well, you're talking about freedom of speech and censorship. And I say, hey, we've agreed a long time ago that all speech isn't free. It's illegal to walk into an unlit movie theater and yell fire where none exists. This is this is bollocks.
Well,
We've
right.
had
And
standards.
yeah, and I can tell you, having worked at a magazine, having been at Huffington Post when it was really cranking up, having worked in done some work in documentary filmmaking and television, that whenever we saw anyone misbehaving, user-generated content, right? Whether it was a letter to the editor that we just wouldn't publish, whether it was a caller into a radio show where we'd have to cut them off because they were misbehaving, or whether it was even one of our advertisers who wanted to push the envelope on something and we couldn't run their ad. Like we had
Yes.
standards. And now we're living in a world in which there are zero, not just zero standards, but as you say in your book, the worst behavior is the stuff that is actually appreciated by the algorithms. It's
Yes.
elevated by
And
the
that's
algorithm.
because psychologically, I can attest to the fact that fear is a very motivating
Yeah.
factor for
Well, I want
any.
yeah, and I want to get into you coined this phrase in the book called neurodystopian conditioning, or NDC. And
Yeah.
you describe it as a psychological shift marked by an increased need for consistency, resistance to dissenting views, and tendency towards more extreme or polarized positions. So, tell us
Yes.
more about neurodystopian conditioning and how you think that's fundamentally changing not just the nature of our dialogue in this country, but actually the way that we're wired.
Yes. What I want to say is important with this concept of neuro dystopian conditioning is that when our internet providers went to go expand globally, uh, I was living in Singapore, and I had been involved with many of our clients in launching their brands in China, Russia, Middle East, Africa. We had experience going through the ropes of who do you talk to in the government and who makes decisions and what's the appropriate cultural behaviors and decorum and so forth. So around the time that China decided to have the Olympics in 2008, which was a wonderful coming out party and saying that they wanted to be part of the global economy, these internet companies from America decided they were going to go and see if they could get distribution of their product in China, Russia, and other places. And of course, they talked to my clients who had experience getting into those countries, and they talked to the advertising people. So I remember meeting with Google and YouTube and Twitter, and they said, how do we do this and what do we do? Well, they went after the Olympics and they called on the governments, and the government said, you're not coming in here. And they went, why? And they said, because we're not developed that yet, and we don't want you having direct access to our people. Okay. So I can say this because I'm an American businessman, but American businessmen can be a little arrogant. And what our businessmen did was we said, well, they can't have a World Wide Web without linking into ours. So we'll wait them out, and we'll go launch in Indonesia and other countries, Japan and other places that are friendly to us. And eventually they're going to have to link in with us. Well, when they were turned down, they weren't losing business, and they didn't have it yet. So, for example, Google and YouTube and Facebook launched in Indonesia. Indonesia region's about 400 million people, bigger than the United States. Most Americans don't know that. It's now the third largest Facebook country in the world because their population has a mean age of 24, like the Americans' population in 1964. Our mean age now is 36 or 37. So they weren't losing business. They were gaining immense wealth, and it was advertising driven. But what happened in Russia and China and other markets was they developed their own internet, and it's government controlled. They don't have these problems of truth and people being bamboozled. They'll go to jail. And I'm not saying that that's a way to handle it, but you can understand having an extremist controlled internet doesn't have these same problems. It has other problems, propaganda and other things. So what I started to understand was something that I mentioned, that this guy who had been involved in brainwashing during the Korean War. And I kept trying to get him to talk to me about it. And he had me read some books while I was writing my first book. And they were things like on how ideas propagate by Toffler, and the viral marketing and viral ideas, and how tribal ideas start, and cults and religious things. And these things were really interesting to me. But then he asked me to read a book right near the end before he passed away. And it was called Influence. And it's called Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. It's written by a former professor at Arizona State who's a behavioral psychologist. And he did research, and he found that there's like 7 different psychological levers that are common with most human beings. And they're not to be used for Machiavellian reasons, but he said they're very common. Things like scarcity. When you find out that something's not as available, it becomes more valuable to you. Like during COVID, finding out that toilet paper was going to be short. Well, it's sold out. There are other ideas like social power. Social power is advertising that says that it's America's favorite, it's the most popular brand, and in other words, you should buy it because you can be sure you're not the only one. And he got to a thing called commitment consistency. And when he talked about commitment consistency, I thought he was going to tell me about how, there's Ford families and Chevrolet families and people that like McDonald's and people that like Burger King, and they stick with it. And that was sort of what he was talking about, but he went back and studied what happened in the Korean War with our servicemen who were brainwashed using the Chinese method of brainwashing. And my book goes in and explains this, but the fundamental aspect of it was a method of belief change. It was a method of changing somebody's belief system. And human beings have a very simple way of looking at things. They get perceptions, and those perceptions lead to their beliefs, and their beliefs dictate their behavior. So if you're creating a communications program, you can see somebody's behavior and work back and do research and find out what their belief systems were. What the Chinese were doing was they were very gradually moving the belief systems of the soldiers by having them write down what they were saying. And when you write something down, you're using more parts of your brain than you are when we're communicating synchronously. When you communicate in writing, you're as you would know from letters you sent to your uncle or aunt, it's asynchronous. It happens, and then another one happens, but there's no dialogue happening, no information transfer while the communication is being written. Whereas I can see with this Zoom session, I can see you, I can see if you're following me or not. It's not as good as if we were here together. So I can't quite see your eyes, and I don't know if you're wearing gym shorts or not. But it's better than email. It's better than texting and typing. And so when I read this, I called my friend who was 89 years old, and I said, "Did you have me read this book because of the brainwashing technique?" And he said, "Well, I thought you'd find it interesting." And I said, "I did, but do you think that as we've shifted from dominant face-to-face communication to dominant typing and texting, which we have in America, that we have become more vulnerable to belief change weaponry?" And he said, "I don't know. That's a good theory. Why don't you ask the author?" So I tracked down Cialdini, and he had the best answer of a professor I've ever heard. He said, "I haven't done that research yet." But I've since done a lot of research and investigating. And if you go in and use Chat GPT to do some research with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, you'll find out that it is a phenomenon. It's not labeled as a mental disorder yet, but it's very definitely something. And it shows up in cults, in religions, and politics. So our Reformation is affecting our relationships. It's affecting our politics. It's affecting religion. And I've devoted a chapter in my book to a theologian who's approaching this change that we're happening from a theological standpoint. And the title of his chapter is "When Theology Meets Algorithm." And I didn't touch a word of what he said because I thought it was so fascinating. And then what happened was I decided to name it. And I realized that we know more about how the brain works today than we did in 1994 because of neuroscience. We can actually see the other parts of our brain being accessed when we write, when we type, and when we text. And there's research that shows that. And so I decided to call it neuro because it's provable. And I called it dystopian because dystopian is is dark and confusing and fearful. And I called it conditioning because, like getting fit and like working out, it doesn't happen like that. It happens over time and you don't notice it. And
Yeah,
that's what
and
we're
what's
having.
remarkable about it, and by the way, Tim, we only have about 10 minutes left at this point. So if anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A, which you can see in my case, it's to the right of the share button down on the bottom of my Zoom screen. Um, but what I think is important about it, and then I want to switch to fixes really quickly, is this notion that amidst this liberation of information and the massive multiplication of speakers, right, of people with opinions, Twitter, Facebook, etc., people are actually not looking with this neurodystopian conditioning, as you've said, they're actually not looking for greater diversity viewpoint. They're looking for less because
Yes,
because of
what
the
the
chaos, that's
research
why
says is
they're looking for the consistency, and they end up becoming more polarized as a result. Whereas you would think it'd be the opposite, right? If a grocery store had one bag of potato chips a year ago, and now all of a sudden has 50 bags, 50 different brands of potato chips, you'd think people would be consuming different brands of potato chips, right? But in this case, your argument is they're actually consuming fewer brands because they're too intimidated by the number of brands out there.
that happens, but some also get hooked on there's individuals. The one thing about this new media is that if you were a sugar cookie recipe chef, and you wanted to communicate some ideas or sell some of your recipes to other sugar bakers, you never could have reached them in the past. But now with the internet, you can find out where they are and you can communicate directly to them. And this is it's a different kind of advertising because it's more bespoke to the individual. And the I've covered the fact that we have some evidence of this kind of phenomenon in the past. There's another factor that happens, and that is when you confront somebody with this possibility, they feel threatened that you're trying to tell them that they were wrong.
Right.
And I'm not trying to tell people that they were wrong. I'm trying to tell people that we've been misled and it's been unwitting. And the last thing that I say is that we've put in, we've never had our information in America so controlled by so few corporations. They are so powerful that as they go, so goes our stock market. They call it the Magnificent Seven. And that Magnificent Seven, or at least the top 10 internet digital companies, are bigger as an industry than the automobile industry, the guns and ammo industry, the aerospace industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the consumer packaged goods industry. We've never had our information so controlled by so few. And even when Hearst ran all those magazines in Curtis at the turn of the century, they didn't have this kind of control, this kind of penetration. And when the three networks started in the 60s and 70s and had such a dominant face in American life, they didn't have this kind of control. And you're seeing it's dangerous. These are, people call it big tech. I don't call it big tech. It's not just big, it's a technopoly. These are oligarchs. And some of those oligarchs are from outside the United States.
Mhm.
Because when we went off and set up our internet, we left ours wide open for other countries to come in and hack into our system, to come in with content that you can't tell. It looks like it's coming from somebody in your town or somebody in your school. That it's a girl who's interested in you, and you get all titillated by that and find out that it's somebody from Nigeria that's using sextortion.
Right.
It's just
Or it's a
crazy.
Russian bot trying to divide you and get you to vote a certain way. So,
Yes.
let's talk about fixes then really quickly
Okay.
because unless we begin fixing this problem, this is all just going to continue getting worse. In
Yes.
the book, you
But
talk about you
one,
talk about
one, you had a nice segue in because when, when Charlie Kirk, the unfortunate tragedy happened, there's a group called uh, NewsGuard, and they surveil the internet for content that is being penetrated into our people. And it's run by a former journalist. And when Charlie Kirk's assassination happened, they picked up over 6,000 different sources from Russia disseminating information to Americans about that,
yeah,
trying to
yeah.
influence public, and it was both sides.
Right.
So, what can we do about this?
Yeah,
Well,
you mentioned the Kids Online Safety Act,
yeah,
Section 230 reform.
yeah,
And then interestingly, and I don't think we're gonna have time to get to it because we only have 4 minutes left, campaign finance reform and term limits, which is kind of a higher order fix. But let's just drill a little bit more into Section 230, Tim, for the sake of the folks here who haven't done a lot of thinking about it. I mean, this is, as you said, it's the permission slip that was given to the platforms back in the mid 1990s that allows them to completely escape both libel and defamation, but also product liability laws. Um,
yes.
I mean, shouldn't it be that unless we fix 230, isn't that is that, do you think that that's the end goal is fixing 230, or do you think that that is where we need to start in a way because we need to just go directly to the heart of the matter?
Well, I think we need to start with the Kids Online Safety Act. It's not the end all solution, but your viewers need to know that this was presented at the 118th Congress and was voted on. And when it goes to Congress, it's voted on the Senate, and it goes from the Senate to the House floor, and then it's taken to the president where they can be vetoed or signed. In July of 2024, before the election, the Kids Online Safety Act, which is critically important, particularly to the survivor parents that are growing in this country, it was voted on and approved 91-3 by the Senate. When was the last time we had anything approved by 91-3 in Washington? And so in July, that put the fear of God into the oligarchs because it meant that it was coming. There might be restrictions on them. And again, they're very powerful. So the the Congress took a vacation and came back in September before the election. And the Speaker of the House decided not to put the Kids Online Safety Act before the House. It was never voted on. The
Yeah,
parents who've lost children are beside themselves, and I am too, because I think that it's not enough people are hearing the story about this. So the Online Safety Act has been reproposed by Senator Blumenthal, a Democrat, and Senator Blackburn, a Republican. And it was reproposed in March. It still hasn't been put on before the House
yeah, and I just
because
want to point out that we at Issue One have been lobbying for that bill. We lobbied for its passage, and as you know, Tim, with the Council for Responsible Social Media back in the summer of last year, we're working on it now. Facebook has built some nice data centers in Mike Johnson's district, which is influential for him, I think, in this
how
respect.
coincidental. Yeah.
Incredibly unfortunate. Um, wow. All right.
Okay,
Well,
so that's the
we didn't
first
get
law.
to, we didn't
We
even get
should
to
get
section.
that done. The second thing is
Yep.
we need we need we need communication policy reform.
Yep.
Our policy is 29 years old, and Section 230 is part of that policy. We need a modern policy that protects the security of our country and protects our children. And it shouldn't be hard to do it because we've done it multiple times in the history of this democracy. democracy in this republic.
That's right. And so that's a great ending. We didn't get to a lot, which is why you all should buy the book, which is on one of the Magnificent Seven's websites, Amazon, right? Uh,
Yep.
yeah. But there's so
And
much.
it's on Barnes and Noble online. And I want your viewers to know that you don't make a lot of money when you do a book. I found out that, but I can tell you that any money that comes to me personally after the publishing costs, the printing costs, and the distribution costs, I'm donating to the Council for Responsible Social Media. I
That is
want this
great.
to go to them.
Great. Well, thank you, Tim, and thank you for those who tuned into this. I hope you buy Tim's book. I hope you stay in touch with us at Issue One and the Council for Responsible Social Media. This is a big fight. I believe that we can win it, as does Tim, but it's going to take a lot of effort from all of us. So thanks, Tim, for everything you do, and we'll see you soon.